Welcome to the third and final session of today's part of the conference. And this third panel is entitled Visual Culture in English Religious Spaces. And our first speaker is Lydia McCutcheon, who has recently completed her MSc in Medieval Studies at the University of Oxford. Prior to this, she received her BA in History from the University of Kent at Canterbury. She's interested in the histories of medieval saints and sanctity, pilgrimage and childhood, and the family. Her paper continues the research undertaken for her master's dissertation on the representation of familial relationships in the miracle collections for St. Thomas Becket and the miracle windows of Canterbury Cathedral. Lydia, take it away.
So this year, 2020, is the 850th anniversary of the martyrdom of St. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Owing to the scribal efforts of two monks from the community at Christ Church Cathedral, Canterbury, and the innovative design of the stained glass in the cathedral, his cult is one of the most evidenced of the medieval period. The stained glass programme of the Trinity Chapel, known as the Miracle Windows, provides unique visual evidence of contemporary families. I will argue that these naturalistic depictions of children shed light on childhood play, illness, injury, and death. These visual narratives testify to the emotional attachment between children and their families in the period, as well as the importance of familial affection in childhood miracle narratives. In the context of Canterbury Cathedral, the miracle windows functioned as a visual testament to the power of the saint to intervene in the lives of devotees of any and every age. So the miracle windows are dedicated to the posthumous miracles of St. Thomas Becket, an Archbishop of Canterbury who was brutally murdered by 4 noble knights in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. His biographers tell us that in the immediate aftermath of his murder, lay people were already mopping up blood from the church floor. According to William Fitzstephen, this blood was used in imaginative and creative ways to treat illness and injury. And as a result, healing miracles were said to have taken place from before Becket was canonised and before the cathedral opened its doors to pilgrims. Becket's body was placed in a tomb in the crypt, and pilgrims were admitted to venerate his body from the spring of 1171. Here they could visit the site of the martyrdom, the tomb in which his body lay, and drink or apply water of St. Thomas, his heavily diluted blood. Following a devastating fire in 1174, the east end of the cathedral was completely remodelled. Its new design transformed the monastic cathedral into a pilgrimage-centred space to better accommodate and promote the veneration of St. Thomas at Canterbury. And it was this building programme that saw the glazing of the miracle windows, which were very likely commissioned by the Canterbury monks. Becket's body was translated from his tomb in the crypt into a shrine in the newly built East End with great ceremony in 1220. So the miracle collections for St. Thomas are the textual evidence of the cult at Canterbury, recording the testimonials of pilgrims visiting his tomb. And 2 monks of the cathedral community assumed this responsibility. Benedict of Peterborough, who recorded between 1171 and 1173, and William of Canterbury, who began mid-1172 and continued into the late 1170s. Their collections are colourful accounts of St. Thomas's intervention in the lives of the laity from every sphere of society. These were primarily testimonials of healing, everything from nosebleeds to resurrection from the dead. The miracle windows were glazed and installed in the reconstruction of the east end of the cathedral and were almost certainly all in place by the translation ceremony in 1220. They consist of a series of 10 windows in the ambulatory of the early Gothic Trinity Chapel, 8 of which still contain medieval glass. On the floor plan of the cathedral, the shaded area shows where the shrine stood and the location of the ambulatory windows. And from the 3 examples of the windows given here, you can see the uniform shape of the lancets in this scheme, but within each one, the design and number of panels varies considerably. The simplest surviving miracle sequences contain 2 panels, and the most complex have 9. Each figured panel has a Latin poetic inscription, but not all survive. Each miracle sequence shown in the stained glass is inspired by a testimony recorded in one or both of the Canterbury miracle collections for St Thomas. The task of identifying all of the narrative sequences isn't over, as scholars contend with corroded glass, later restorations and replacements, and missing panels. So having briefly covered the nature of the evidence, we come to the central issue of the depiction of children and family relationships. Scholarship on the medieval family frequently discusses the place and value of children within society and culture. The extent to which childhood was even recognised has been raised at the most fundamental level of this debate. Perhaps the most cited argument for the lack of childhood in the medieval period is still Philip Airy's 1962 monograph, published in English in 1986 under the title Centuries of Childhood. Airy argued that before the 16th century, the portrayal of children lacked naturalism, both in terms of physiology and context, and are thus better described as miniature adults. Furthermore, he used the high infant mortality rates and examples of early medieval funerary monuments that depict children as adults to argue that parents avoided emotional attachment with their children. Airy concluded that childhood was not a medieval concern, either in life or art, a view that survives to a greater or lesser degree in popular culture. Scholars from a wide range of disciplines have since rushed to the defence of medieval childhood and familial affection. Nicholas Orme and Shulamith Shahar, for example, point to the wealth of literature and material culture that suggests medieval childhood had its own culture, and that the ideal family cared for and loved its youngest members. This case is strengthened enormously by the evidence from the Trinity Chapel at Canterbury, and these windows depict the stories of men, women and children healed by St Thomas during the 1170s, a unique subject matter in monumental stained glass. These scenes are unapologetically contemporary, with subjects from all spheres of society pictured in everyday contexts. In their depiction of this wide variety of miracle recipients, the miracle windows differentiate between children and adults, as well as adults of different ages, in a number of ways. Firstly, the scale of the figures can be used as a reasonably accurate indicator of age. To take a couple of examples, in the story of a boy saved from drowning, children are likely to be shown as considerably smaller than adults. Likewise, in window S6, panel 14, showing a resurrected child, the parents are distinctly larger than their son. Overall, the glaziers are very consistent in showing children as smaller than their adult counterparts in this scheme. In addition, looking at the heads of male figures, we see that boys and young men are typically represented as beardless, while older men are bearded. This can be used to make more subtle distinctions between men of different ages, as seen in window N2, panel 58, showing Richard Suniev, cured of leprosy, returning to his master's household. Here his youthful face contrasts with the senior bearded one of his master. Such a distinction naturally does not apply to girls and women, and broadly speaking, their age and stage of life is more difficult to determine. In Sophie Oosterwijk's recent study of the representation of children in the early medieval period, she draws attention to the importance of interaction between subjects to identify their age. And this brings us to our third indication of the age in the miracle windows, the narrative context. The story of Geoffrey of Winchester, rescued twice by St Thomas as a baby, is a good example of this. Whilst his body is smaller than that of his mother and nurse, it's the rocking cradle that signals his extreme youth. So owing to their natural depiction of children, the miracle windows are a unique source of information on childhood play, illness, injury and death. Children at play are amongst the subjects of the first panel in a sequence dedicated to a boy saved from drowning. And here a group of boys stone frogs by the river, and one of them accidentally falls in. The group of boys on the right-hand side, shown here, are practically falling over one another in their eagerness to get to the frogs, making it easy to see how one boy has ended up in the river. Each boy has a stone in hand, and one of them has collected his stones in the upturned hem of his tunic for his next target. I should point out that of these beautiful enlarged frogs at the bottom of the panel, the one on the far right has been replaced. The vitality of this scene captures the energy and exuberance of childish games, and it is this that gives the scene an almost timeless quality. The Glaziers established a pattern of parental and familial response to childhood illness and injury, characterised by concern for their children's welfare. The stories of Geoffrey of Winchester and A Boy Saved from Drowning both depict parents discovering their children's fates. The drowned boy's parents arrive at the riverbank and are horrified to see his limp body being pulled out of the water. The details in this scene are particularly effective at drawing our attention to their reaction. The hunched postures of the other boys waiting on the bank, which worked so beautifully in this petal-shaped panel, watch the boy's parents anxiously. The parents themselves lean forward in their attempt to reach their son, the mother's arms stretched out to him, the father's raised together in a gesture of anguish. Paint loss to the mother's face makes her expression difficult to read, but both parents' large, expressive eyes are trained on their son. In a similar way, in the story of Geoffrey of Winchester, his mother, pictured in red and white, and his nurse in green, react to the sight of Geoffrey buried in the rubble of their collapsed house, and you can see his little head is just visible. The mother's pose is decidedly awkward, with her body twisted away from her son, her arms raised and head turned back over her shoulder. Perhaps the glazier wanted the arch of her back to mirror the arc of the panel, or to express her desire both to look and not to look at the terrible sight before her. It is certainly dynamic. The gesticulating arms of both women contribute to the sense of horror and helplessness. Both panels share a depiction of parental concern regarding the accidents and injuries of children. These examples reinforce the argument for strong emotional attachment within familial units, and particularly involving children in this period. This is also true of the attitudes on display towards infant death. The small motif of a body laid out on a bier whilst their grief-stricken family looks on can be seen at least 3 times in the glass, in addition to a child's funeral. The distress of the Fitzisylfs shown here upon the death of their son William is a poignant example. Once again, gesture and eyeline are very telling of their emotional response to this event. And in addition, the tableau of a healed child in bed surrounded by their grateful parents is found in 2 surviving panels. This is a far cry from the emotional detachment and resignation to the prevalence of infant death described by Aries and others. The overall impression across the miracle narratives is that families were concerned for their children's health, mourned their deaths, and celebrated their cures. Of course, these images of doting parents are not representative of the full spectrum of attitudes and actions towards children within the period. A broader range is found in the miracle collections, the textual source for the windows. However, none of these were chosen for the stained glass programme at Canterbury. This reflects the small number involving mistreatment of children and perhaps the disapproval of the designer and patrons. So the rationale behind the inclusion of these particular stories remains open to debate. Of the 700 miracles recorded by the Canterbury monks, only a handful were chosen for visual display in the Trinity Chapel. Madeline Harrison Cavaness has suggested that the monks were influenced in their decisions by donations of pilgrims who wanted to commemorate and immortalise their stories in the windows of the cathedral. This argument is supported by the fact that child beneficiaries in the 1170s would have reached maturity by the time the glazing programme was complete at the turn of the century. However, as Rachel Koopmans has pointed out in her study of the depiction of Kentish pilgrims in the miracle windows, donations of monumental stained glass in this period were usually limited to wealthy groups or individuals, rather than ordinary laymen and women. Instead, she argues that the monks selected stories based on factors such as the themes and cures they considered important to the cult, local pride, or the fame of individual stories. Both points of view rely on a certain amount of speculation and supposition, and further evidence is needed for a resolution. What we can be more certain of is that regardless of the process of selection, the scheme had the potential to inspire and encourage families to seek the aid of the saint on behalf of their children and household members. Positioned in the Trinity Chapel around the shrine of St Thomas, the miracle windows were on prominent display to visiting pilgrims. They are testament to the miraculous power of the saint to cure anyone, regardless of gender, status, or age. So this unique stained glass programme reflects the diverse ages of pilgrims who called on the aid of St Thomas in the late 12th century. Its importance for the study of the culture of childhood and the place of children within the familial unit has been somewhat undervalued, which is surprising considering the multiple representations of children and families in everyday and devotional contexts. Stylised though they may be, these panels show near contemporary children playing by the river, visiting the tomb of St Thomas, and interacting with members of their family and household. The overwhelming impression is that these relationships were loving and affectionate. These sequences address the emotional toll of childhood, injury, illness, and death upon the family, as well as the joy upon recovery. Stories concerning children are particularly well placed to show the importance of family members in the events of miraculous encounter. Their integral role in the event narrative suggests that the impact of miraculous childhood, suffering, and recovery was understood in broad communal terms. Finally, the miracle windows functioned as a visual testament to the power of the saint to work in the lives of pilgrims of all ages. These miracles, set in recognisable quotidian contexts, were designed so that the viewer could identify themselves as the type of the individuals represented. Families could take comfort in these stories and see themselves as potential candidates for the aid of the martyr. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Crystal Hollis, who is currently doing her PhD on historic graffiti at the University of Exeter, where she was awarded a Global Excellence Scholarship. She is focusing primarily on the relationship between graffiti and social space in the churches of Suffolk, and her most notable work discusses the discovery of medieval inscriptions in a transplanted French chapel which is currently located in Milwaukee, which must be a story in itself. The title of her paper is Graffiti as a Historical Resource, Parish History on Church Walls. Crystal.
Right, hello, thank you all for sticking around. I know it's getting dark outside, but yes, I am looking at graffiti as a historical research, parish history on church walls. So the study of graffiti is probably the first thing I need to address. When I'm talking about graffiti, I'm not talking about spray paint on bridges and train cars. I'm talking about historic graffiti, which for me usually means scratches on walls in parish churches, although we do find scratches on walls in castles and historic houses and other places as well. So one of the things that current graffiti studies does is it looks at a particular kind of inscription and goes, oh, this is that shape, so this must mean that. And what my work does is it kind of reverses that, and instead of looking at what a shape might mean and then trying to interpret the building that way, I look at where things are in the building and what is happening in those regions of the building, and use that to try and figure out what the graffiti means. And then I try to contextualize those within a kind of landscape, using the church itself as a landscape. So my project is specifically focused on the Risbridge 100 in Suffolk. We've got the one map for you there with all of the hundreds, and Risbridge is right over here by Cambridge and Essex. So it's very far inland, and it's jokingly referred to when I'm out on site anyway as welcome to forgotten Suffolk. It's forgotten Suffolk. I don't know why it's forgotten, but probably because it's so far inland and far away from the wool trade. And this other map I have for you, it has all the different parishes that make up the Risbridge 100. The ones with the stars are the ones that I'm researching personally. So that is Ousden, Lydgate, Coolidge, Stradishall, Denstone, Stansfield, and Wickham Brook. The one we're looking at in particular today, because we only have time for one, is St. Margaret in Stradishall. I chose this particular region of Suffolk, by the way, because places like Lydgate and Coolidge are known for their high quality and high quantities of graffiti. It's mentioned in books by Violet Pritchard, who did English medieval graffiti, and it's also been surveyed by the Suffolk Medieval Graffiti Survey. So, St. Margaret Stradishall. It has about 142 graffiti inscriptions, which is not much when you compare it to St. Margaret and Coolidge, which has 625. I know this because I counted every single one of them myself. To put graffiti in a proper context, I need to give a little bit of a building history so you get an idea of what's going on. Most of the graffiti that we have in this building is going to be very late medieval on, because the building itself has been present since 1086, but we have a lot of expansions going on. As early as the 13th century, we have the chancel and the nave being expanded. Then in about 1300, we have the north aisle and the west tower added at the same time. And then around 1350, we have the south aisle added on. In between that last addition and now, there's not a lot in terms of records of building, but we do know that there was a massive restoration done by the Victorians, which included reseating in the mid-19th century. If you look kind of down the aisle here, we have the chancel arch, and you can see right here, this is where the rood loft used to be. And this is the only remaining bit of the screen that's left in its in situ, in its actual place. Parts of it are framed here for decoration, and they've been there for years. So we have a lot of stuff that's already missing. The rood screen's gone. They don't seem to be any massive images in here. There's no statues. We have one wall painting of an actual person or a saint. This is St. Christopher. He's on the north wall of the nave near the door. I included two pictures. You could see how large he is when compared to the door. This is significant because St. Christopher is usually painted on the north side of churches, usually very large, so that you can see him from the south door. Look in, and there's an interaction when somebody looks at an image of a saint in the medieval era where you touch them with your eyes, therefore invoking them. St. Christopher protected from sudden death and the plague. So you could look in, see him, and be protected kind of for the rest of the day. We note St. Christopher because if you look very closely in this image, you can see his hand holding a staff. And then we have the child on top here, and his little arm is reaching out. But apart from that, as you can see, very degraded image. There's really not much left to it apart from those little details that tell us what it is. We do have some early modern wall painting schemes showing up in here, but it's usually decorative, just a little motif, or it's this, which is a Bible verse from the book of John. There is mention of a wall painting of St. Margaret, anecdotally in kind of leaflets, but where this painting was, there's no actual clue to it. We just know that it was somewhere in the building. So we don't know if it was part of the chancel, if it was on the south wall, if it was on one of the piers, if it was small, if it was large. We have no data for that, and we have no data for any of the statues that may have been present. What we do have data for is a reference to the Guild of St. Margaret being present here in the 14th century. Obviously, St. Margaret had a bit of an influence on what's going on here, but we don't know if it was a kind of crafting guild or any sort of kind of local tradition going on there. We also have a will referencing to leave money, to leave cloths for 3 altars. It doesn't say if these are for private chapels, if these are to particular saints, just 3 altars. So we know there were 3 of them in the 15th century. There's a mention of the sepulchre of our Lord of Stradishall in another will, and then some money left for the light of the image of St. Mary, but nothing specific about what kind of image this was or where, again, this image was. So this lack of remaining paintings and the lack of knowledge that we have about any statues that were present gives us challenges, because we tend to look at graffiti as something that is either interacting with a space or an item or reacting to a space or an item or an event. So without that, we kind of have to scale back our interpretations and look at things a bit more broadly and look at, you know, okay, this is in the south side of the building, so it could mean this. This is in the north side of the building, it could mean this. And this is what I'm going to take you through. So the survey that we did this autumn, because we had, I think, 2 days in September, because of COVID, we didn't have as much time as we wanted to do some of the 3D imaging and other kind of recording techniques that we wanted to do. but we did record everything in the building. And one of the things we came across a couple times was this. If you look, you'll see a bit of a circle peeking out here, a little petal here, and another one here. This is a very common type of graffiti. It's a compass-drawn hex foil, and it's hidden underneath the plaster. There's not any areas on the piers, which is where we typically find graffiti, that are really coated in plaster, but there's bits on piers that are coated in plaster all over. So we know that there's probably a handful of inscriptions that we don't have access to, therefore we don't know what they are, therefore they're not included in the data set. So we have that. So there's 142 in the building. 18 of the graffiti are words or phrases or names, so properly written out things. 11 are initials, which I tend to classify as either 2 or 3 letters strung together. 8 VV marks, which do with protection. We'll deal with them later. 5 human figures. 1 is drawn in pencil, so we know that that's much, much more recent than the medieval stuff that I'm looking at. So it's recorded for the sake of good archaeological practice and conservation, but kind of excluded from the study, so to speak. We have 18 circle designs, which may or may not be protective. Again, we'll touch on that in a bit. And 1 animal. And when we look at the floor plan of this building, with the graffiti kind of laid out on it, we have kind of an odd distribution going on. We have this southwest pillar that has 50 inscriptions on it. And when you've only got 142 in the entire building, that's quite a lot. And then we've got the chancel arch, which has rather a lot compared to some of the other churches in this area. So I want to talk about this pier with 50 inscriptions on it first. It has the most diverse collection of graffiti in the building, which makes sense. Typically in the south of buildings, Pamela Graves has mentioned in her work, this is where people would wait for things to happen, or where people would have their social gatherings. So it's very possible that stuff like this bird, probably a peacock, which, side note, very exciting. It's very rare when you can find a bird in graffiti and figure out roughly what kind of bird it is. They're usually very vague. So you have people kind of just doodling little things, or this could be related to a family or a bit of heraldry, or have a personal significance to an individual. So while people are waiting, they can be drawing these things. They can also be drawing protective things like this. This is a game board. They're typically associated with protection because when you play it, you can't play it on a vertical surface, but when you do play it, the idea of the game is to either trap something in the center or push something out. So the idea on a wall is you either trap something negative on the inside in the center so it can't follow you around and go anywhere, or you chase it out so it leaves the building and it can't follow you around anymore. So that's another type of graffiti we have there. And then we have this. So circle designs get really tricky. Typically when we see anything with an unending line, we affiliate it with, ooh, it must be there to confuse evil spirits, because there was a mindset that demons were stupid, and if there's a line and it doesn't end, it must follow it forever and ever and ever, and it can't go anywhere. However, when we look at this, it's kind of sloppy. It's relatively low to the floor in placement on the pillar. So someone could have easily just been sitting there kind of scratching and being kind of bored and doodling it. And I would certainly classify this one as a doodle rather than apotropaic, because apotropaic marks tend to be a little more organized. They tend to have a certain like almost format to them, and the design is a little bit clearer. So wrapping up on that pier, what we basically have is an area in the church where people are gathering, waiting, doing a number of things that impact the building, kind of safety in the building, but also communicating with each other and communicating with the divine. So that is a kind of space where that is happening very specifically and very deliberately. We're going to move on to the chancel arch because there's quite a lot there, which is odd. Usually we get less in the chancel arch. People expect less in the chancel graffiti-wise overall, because the chancel was where the clergy were based. It was holier, so people don't expect so many inscriptions like you get in the nave. However, we have the bulk of the writing is in the chancel arch in this church. I think we have 2 names here. Paleography is not my wheelhouse, but it looks like these both say John. And then we have a very large Amen there at the bottom. And this is just a handful of several other names and bits that look like they could be parts of a Bible verse, parts of maybe a prayer or a psalm or a parable, also on these walls. So there is an idea that people would go into the chancel and write their names to try and reclaim it from the clergy. I don't have any evidence of that for this church, so I would suspect that the names that are listed here are more to do with the clerics themselves. We do have this kind of behavior of clergy writing their names and leaving signatures on walls in other churches. Jones Baker discusses it in her work, specifically in Anstey and Stanford La Hope. There's also the highest concentration of crosses in the chancel arch, which seems like it would make sense. Churches and crosses are two things that traditionally go together. However, we have a lot of small crosses. They're all quite small. This one that you see here in the middle with the bars on the end is quite large compared to the others. And we have all types. We have the basic simple cross, we have ones like this one, and we have ones where it's a cross with dot terminals or dots on the end. So we have a bit of a variety of going. And crosses can be and often are affiliated with the making of oaths and vows, and sometimes with pilgrimage. This church, certainly not a pilgrimage site, may have been on a route, possibly, not likely. If there is a connection to pilgrimage, it would be somebody making a cross as they left to symbolize, you know, making my journey, or making a cross when they came back, symbolizing that they had fulfilled their promise and fulfilled their journey and their voyage. However, these conclusions are frankly, they're tentative at best. We need more information on how people were using crosses in a kind of oath and vow / promise kind of way in the parish before we can put an actual meaning on these, but those are the main options. Also in the chancel arch, St. Margaret Stradishall has a very weird chancel arch because it's got two figures in it. And usually when you get images in chancel arches, they're quite small. They're like little tiny sketches. This one is huge. If you look here on the right, you can see kind of a face. There's a nose, there's an eye. That probably helps. You've got one face on the right talking to one face on the left. Now, when we initially recorded this, we didn't even notice the face on the left-hand side, the smaller one. We only noticed the big one, and that's because a lot of times when you're doing just, you know, naked eye graffiti, you can miss things. One of the things that I want to point out that we need to do better with archaeology and graffiti is how we record it. And one of the things that I've done is a photogrammetry scan of this pier. Because what I noticed as I started to look at what was going on in the pier when I was recording the graffiti and writing out all the data was that there was a lot of lines going on in here, but then a kind of triangle shape here. And when I stitched the photos together, it's quite clear that this entire thing is one image. It's one figure, and the small figure actually goes down to here. Now, this isn't the final image. It still needs some cleaning up and some tweaking. However, we can't really date it right now. We probably won't be able to date it even when we clean it up, but we'll be able to see a little bit clearer the arms and the clothing here in the middle of this particularly large figure, which you don't normally find in chancel arches at all in parish churches. They're usually much, much smaller. Moving on from the chancel arch, I want to briefly touch on protection in churches and people's preoccupation with apotropaic marks. This is a taper burn. There's two in the building. They're both on this door. This is the most obvious one. I've put it in a red box for you. Wood is very difficult to photograph, so I'm sorry if it's hard for you to see, but it basically looks like a little flame just in black, where somebody took a candle, touched it to wood, and waited for it to kind of like burn a small indentation. The idea there is that once you touch the wood with fire, it doesn't need to be touched by fire again, so therefore it's protected. Even though there's only two of these present in the building, it does show that there's a little bit of worry about protection and a little bit of focus on keeping things safe, which leads us to VV marks. So VV marks are sometimes called Marian marks. They're sometimes incorrectly called witch marks. I just call them VV marks. There aren't many in the building, but where they are is quite telling. They're near doorways and the archway, so where people are moving through spaces and going in and out of spaces. Typically, when you see a VV mark, you have to go, is it part of a damaged set of initials, and make sure that there's no letters near it. These do not. and also make sure that they are not so neat that they are Mason's mark. If you look at this one and you see the two intersecting V's, they're upside down, so it looks more like an M. You can see that the grooves are quite wide, so it's not as neat and tidy as we would expect a Mason's mark to be. So this is probably somebody invoking a form of protection. Later on, it's suggested that this becomes almost a good luck charm sort of thing. And that's what we're getting in these spaces. And we get a similar pattern with circles. Not every circle is protective. We do have a couple in here that are large and clearly done with mason's dividers, and clearly part of some sort of architectural planning. The vast majority of them, excluding that one doodly one I showed earlier, are small. They're usually flower designs are just a simple circle with some lines in it. They're very basic, but they're very neat. And again, we're getting a higher concentration on that one pillar where people are coming and going, where people are using as a social space. And then an odd grouping in the chancel. The only 4 graffiti I found in a window in the entire church are there in the chancel, and four of them are circles. None of them are large enough to be part of any sort of architectural design or any sort of decorative scheme. This is the one in the window. As you can see, it's more than 10 centimeters. There is this dot in the center, and it goes out to petals that you can sort of see, making a kind of nice little elaborate design. But again, it's not there for any sort of formal scheme or any sort of formal plan. It's just there serving a kind of role of filtering out negative things that could come in and out of the window. So yeah, so with all this graffiti we've got in this church, all 142 inscriptions, what does it actually tell us? So it basically tells us that we have a community that's using the building socially with different zones. So for example, that one pillar that I keep going back to with the bird and the game board, which is likely a place to gather and wait. And while you would do that, you would also ask for protection or invoke protection on your way somewhere. We also appear to have a very active clergy with regards to graffiti, which, you know, is neither here nor there. But it's important in this case because we have names, we have actual names going on. Sometimes in chancel arches, we only get small images and designs or a couple of letters, but here we have names, and that's hugely critical because hopefully we can track some of them down and know who these people were. And while it's not a guarantee that all the graffiti in the chancel is clerical, we can assume that there's some sort of tradition going on with writing and recording in the holiest part of the church, just given the collection of things that are there and all the crosses that are present as well. So through graffiti, we can conclude that St. Margaret Stradishall was a vibrant building where the people of the parish gathered not only for mass, but also to meet, to make vows and ask for divine protection. Thank you.